Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Here at the Democracy Program, we work to ensure our democracy has transparent and fair processes, trustworthy and accountable institutions, and civic-minded and bipartisan leaders. The Democracy Program houses the Campus Free Expression Project, which is led by Director Jackie Peppermero. Over the past 5 years, the project has worked to restore open discourse on college campuses in order to foster independent thinkers and engaged citizens. Revitalizing a culture of healthy civil discourse is the theme of today's event. The conversation will focus on a new book by Professor John Inazu, Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. I will now turn it over to Matt Kukum, the Associate Director of the Campus Free Expression Project, to introduce today's panelists and to moderate the conversation. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Matt. And thank you all for joining us today for what I think is going to be a great conversation. As all of you, I'm sure, know very well, we live in a very polarized country. Intensifying tribalism and culture wars increasingly undermine respectful discourse and tear apart the social fabric of our culture. Moreover, our country is the most diverse in the world. The tremendous diversity of values and experiences in our pluralistic society makes reasonable, good faith disagreements difficult to navigate. This is especially true when we engage with those people who we think are deeply wrong. Given this context, can we, in fact, learn to disagree well? Professor John Inazu, in the title of his latest book, indicates that the answer to that question is yes. The book is titled Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. The book is going to be released on April 2nd, and I am so pleased that Professors John Inazu and Sarah Pessin have joined us to discuss the book in advance of its release. John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. John has authored many books and articles and is an expert on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly, the latter of which John will tell you is perennially underrated. Sarah Pessin is professor of philosophy and Jewish thought at the University of Denver. She holds an interfaith chair and has also written many books and articles on a wide range of interdisciplinary and intercultural areas of thought, ranging from Neoplatonism to the philosophy of religion to interfaith civics. So John and Sarah, thank you both for being with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Before we dive into the conversation, I just want to share a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, I'd like to thank Zondervan for offering our viewers 2 free chapters of the book. And secondly, in the last 20 minutes of our time, we'll take questions from the audience. At any time during this program, you are welcome to submit a question using the live chat on YouTube or on X using the hashtag BPCLive. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. And John, let's start with a quick overview of your book, which has a rather unique format. So from a 30,000-foot level, what is your book about? And why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Let me start with the second question. Why did I decide to write it? It was the middle of COVID, and we were all isolated and lonely and shouting outrageous claims at each other across the Ethernet. And I thought, if we're going to work our way out of this, we need to figure out some better tools and better practices. So that was the impetus for the book. And what occurred to me, I mean, I spent a lot of my time teaching law students. What occurred to me is the teaching of law and legal education actually has something for the rest of us, that it can show people how to have better conversations around the dinner table or at the workplace or in the neighborhood, and that there are methods and tools and activities that we teach in law. You don't have to go to law school to learn them, but they can aid in our work toward empathy and understanding. So that was the pitch for the book. And then I thought, if I can frame this in a narrative-based way that's focused more on stories and less on principles, that it might be more engaging for readers. And that's what I tried to do here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, I suspect, on this, tuning in today, are deeply sympathetic to the idea of trying to use empathy and respect in our day-to-day discourse. I want to probe you before we bring in Sarah. I want to probe you on a couple of related points and get your response, and then we're going to broaden out the conversation. So I think some people on both the political left and the political right might be a bit skeptical about your call for empathy and respect. As much as I like it, there might be some skepticism. And so let's identify the two sides very briefly. So if we're starting with the political right, there's a concern that empathy and respect are code words used by progressives who want to perhaps exclude conservatives or shut down their expression because conservative views are deemed disrespectful or even bigoted. So how would you address the conservative concern that empathy and respect are just a canard for progressive ideals? And then on the other side, we'll take these together. Some on the political left are concerned that respect and empathy are in tension with free expression. Healthy discourse perhaps is not compatible with free expression. And I think this seems to be the motivation behind some of the restrictions that we've seen on expression on college campuses. So would you say there's something to the progressive concern that there's a trade-off between free expression and civility?
Yeah, so a couple of things, Matt. It's an important set of questions. The first is there are always going to be people in this country who are not interested in the kinds of arguments that I'm making about finding common ground, exploring compromise, and working to live together in a pluralistic and diverse society. And that means the alternative for those people is either they pull away and try to do their own thing in perpetuity, or they try to win at all costs and crush the other side. But we're not going to get rid of those people in society. And so we have to recognize that they're there, but they're probably not the people reading my books, unfortunately. So what do we do then with those arguments or people who might be persuaded by those arguments? Well, one initial thought is we could actually use those examples to illustrate the mode of engagement that I'm talking about in this book. So to the person on the right who believes those ideas, or to the person on the left, I would say, can you make the best possible argument for the other side? Why might someone be concerned with empathy and respect in these ways? Or why might someone be concerned with challenges to free speech in certain environments? Can you articulate in the most sympathetic way possible why those concerns are out there? And that as a thought experiment or an exercise in self-reflection would be a really good thing for people to do. Now, it turns out, and we're Sarah and I are both in higher ed spaces, and the university becomes a very good test case for a lot of these ideas. And the answer is it's complicated. The university is a very complex ecosystem, and there are some places where people need to work a whole lot more on being challenged by ideas. And then there are some places, and I mean within the same institution, there, you walk across campus and there are other spots where you should just be with your people and left alone. And until people recognize the complexity of the campus environment, we'll have this shouting back and forth of absolutes, neither of which actually name the reality that students, teachers, and the rest of the university ecosystem actually live into.
Sarah, I'd love to get your thoughts at this point. What did you take away from the book? Where do you find yourself in agreement, or where you might want to press or question John in his arguments?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I want to elevate, one of the things I really like about John, this book and your other work, and even how you just framed your first comment there, you do a really great job of elevating what, for lack of a better term, I might call the discomforts of democracy. The idea that things are messy, not as an afterthought, but as an important element of the main thought. Things are messy, things are, I sometimes refer to a prickly pluralism. And so I find it refreshing in your work. You're coming at it from a different discipline. And I find it very rare, honestly, to find writers where I write in the notes, discomforts of democracy, prickly pluralism, because that's kind of how I typify what I find most important, separate from, I don't work on law, but just working on interfaith civics and general questions of interhuman exchange. So I first wanted to lift that up, that I think that that's interesting, that I don't find that as common, the sort of willingness to sort of double down into that fact of the situation. And in that regard, as was mentioned earlier, you in actually the connection with law, you look and focus our attention to that assembly sort of clause, the idea that if we really want to understand how to get along as a country, we actually have to focus on the most uncomfortable moment of a kind of protecting assembly, up to and including, and this you write in a different work of yours, we want to protect people and all their messiness, whether it's on campus or off campus, up to and including friction, uncertainty, and as you write, even instability. And so when I look at the title of your new book, Learning to Disagree, it's exciting that you're a thinker where the disagree actually has some real depth to it. It's a real disagree that you lift up in your work. So I have a question that I want to ask you in a moment, but I guess just to sort of ask you to think of, for the first piece is, that's one of the things that strikes me most about your work is that you take the disagree much more seriously than many. And so I wonder if maybe you can reflect on that characterization of your work and whether you, as I do, bemoan the fact that for some reason people don't like to recognize that that's the secret sauce.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I appreciate your highlighting that point. I like the phrase prickly pluralism a lot better than some of the adjectival alternatives out there. I think key to this is really just a basic intuition about human beings, and we kind of all know this at heart, but we pretend that it's not there in these pluralism discussions, that people have these deeply held beliefs over things that really matter, and they're not going away. And because of that, you're right. All that we have, you could call it mess, you could call it tragedy, you could call it instability and discomfort, but that's the reality of democracy, and that's not going to change in a very diverse and pluralistic society. And when we have seen past efforts toward, understandably well-motivated efforts toward unity or common ground that try to paper over those differences. I think of sort of multiculturalism in the 1990s. A lot of that was, let's all come together and, pretend that we don't really disagree. And especially in the interfaith context, that didn't work because people who brought their whole faith commitments to an interfaith table didn't agree quite extensively. They disagreed over things that really mattered. And so when you start there and when you say there's going to be some discomfort that follows from this disagreement, there's going to be some mess, you're going to be around people that you will not fully agree with or even click with, but you still have to be citizens, neighbors, and sometimes even friends with those people. And that there's a beauty and a creativity in that, but I think it's only unleashed when you start with that basic point of, this is messy, it's not going to be wrapped up with a bow. And then I think a related but different point is, and that necessarily leads to a kind of instability. So we heard sort of in the video leading into this session that democracy is a verb. I don't know about the grammar of that, but the idea that democracy is active, yes, it has to be an ongoing conversation, but it's a conversation that is never fully resolved or fully stabilized. So that conversation itself is going to be risky. It's going to mean that there's ongoing compromise, that politics will change, that sometimes we'll be the winners and sometimes we'll be the losers. And for the sake of all of us, we need to sort of figure out what those roles mean within the democratic experiment.
Yeah, that's really great. I appreciate that. And I'm delighted to hear that that does stand out to you as something that maybe is, as it does to me, that somehow, I almost feel that sometimes people feel like, oh, don't be so pessimistic. And it's like, no, it's not pessimistic. That's how democracy works. And if we don't start there, then the idea that we would fix it doesn't even get off the ground, since what we'd be trying to fix is a non-existent entity. So I really appreciate that. And so to take that further, that is, so again, you're in that space, the disagreements are going to flow. And here I want to ask, even in just how you said it, and I get this because having not met you before and having read your work, including the new work, I get the impression that you're a friendly and nice person. In fact, you end the book with friendship, but that also comes across in the way you interact with your students, etc. Hopefully, my students and friends would say the same about me. So I don't think it's that I'm sort of looking to disagree and have those difficult moments, but it's rather an acknowledgement of the civic space, which is quite different than the personal or even different circles of influence. One can have certain relationships with one's students, one can have certain relationships with one's friends, but those don't scale, and not only do they not scale to the political situation, but there are plenty of theorists who really encourage us to actually realize that there's a category mistake in thinking that what works between two people, friends or strangers who might want to become friends, is likely not a model for what will work in the political sphere, in as much as the political is something quite different in general, and in particular when we speak about liberal democracy and the ways in which disagreement are part and parcel of it. It's not only that, well, give it a harder try. It's more of a sense of a category mistake to think that, some of what works at the interhuman level would scale up. So I guess I wonder what you feel about that comment. And if so, are you willing to imagine that there might be some kind of a framing value other than friendship? I see, again, you do such a great job of amplifying the messy and the sort of inherent messiness of the situation. And I almost sort of was let down at the end of the book because it ended with friendship. And again, I'm a friendly gal. However, I was like, no, don't go to friendship for this project. So before I go further into some other kinds of alternatives, I think you see what I'm asking, sort of like, why is friendship a good match for even as a goal when it comes to this kind of beast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. There's so much in there that comes to mind as you're asking that question. It's a really important question. I think part of it depends on when we talk about scaling up from the personal to the political, or what do we mean by scale? And so I actually think that part of scale is a scaling of power, but not necessarily a scaling of the number of people. Right? In some ways, actually, when you think about senior political leadership, you're talking about a very small number of people. But the question for me is, how have those people been cultivated and habituated into a set of dispositions and virtues and practices that will allow them to do politics well? So take the Congress of today versus the Congress of 40 years ago, not to be utopian about what it used to be, but there was a sense of I mean, in many cases, actual friendship across the aisle, or at least a set of dispositions or collegiality that is different than certainly what we see in large parts of Congress today. So I actually do think there's something that you learn at the training wheels of your family and your friend group and your early jobs cultivate and habituate you into a certain kind of human being. And then the question is that the kind of human being that then occupies these very significant positions of power that have to do also human work, but the stakes are in many cases much, much higher because of the scale of the effect. And in some of those roles, I also think, and this is where the messiness comes back in, the differences are still significant there, and they're going to limit the scope and maybe the depth of friendship too. So when you have very real differences, I think it's okay to name the limitations. My close friends with whom I have very, very major differences about something that matters a great deal to both of us, we're not going to be able to close that gap. And we can just recognize that we can still be good friends. But to me, when you flip it back to politics, I don't think the goal is to be best friends with the people across the aisle, but it's to be friends. And we're at a place where we don't even have a vision for basic friendship even more. And this actually relates to another point I was thinking of as you were talking, which is the dispositions here underlying friendship. I mean, I think you're right to maybe, I like the kind of critique of the last chapter as maybe too idyllic or too, but I think this is not a how-to manual on friendship, but it is to say that something about the dispositions that can lead to friendship actually matter in our engagement across difference with other people. And I think part of that is, I'm very hesitant about the labels moderate or centrist. I sometimes get called a centrist, and I don't know what that means, because centrist to me is you take the midpoint of two extreme policy views, and that's what you are. And that doesn't describe most human beings. And I'm certainly not a centrist or a moderate on lots of things, but I do have this disposition. And I think good teachers and good people in politics and good lawyers have this, where you can engage with people without blowing up all the time, without using caricatures, without assuming the worst. And that's a kind of moderation and engagement. It's not a moderate position, but it's the way in which you engage. And I think that has something to do with the kind of politics that I would like to see at larger levels of our country.
So both of you highlighted something important, and sort of this idea of we're grappling with complexity, and we need to build our capacity to do that. And perhaps, build some friendships across difference as well. And I was wondering, John, if you could speak to a little bit of what you say in your book, perhaps, about what exactly is involved with building that kind of sort of internal resilience, building up a greater comfort, perhaps, or ability to sort of deal with complexity and gray and difficult issues, and to do that perhaps with people who disagree profoundly. How can people who want to do this, what are some practical things that they can do to actually sort of improve their muscles in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of the practical application depends upon working on this within relationships of trust. And so if you don't have those relationships, step one is to ask yourself, how do I get those? And how do I start with, you don't want to walk into a conversation with someone who's very different than you and just start with the really deep questions. You want to start with getting to know them and finding common ground as human beings. And when I think about the college environment, one of the huge privileges of being able to teach students in the classroom over the course of many weeks is that you have the opportunity to establish these spaces to build trust, and you have an ongoing conversation that gets into things and then pauses, and people go away and then they come back, and it's the same group of people talking about hard issues over and over again. And that's a real gift and privilege of being in a college environment. But you can replicate something like that in your own life. You can find people and say, instead of just one debate or going to some lecture, let's commit to meeting 4 times over the course of the next couple of months and talking about some things. And as we talk about them, we'll also commit to go away and think about what we've said and ask hard questions of ourselves. And that the effort to practice is actually an effort toward empathy itself, because you are opening yourself up to the complexity of another person and the positions and arguments they hold.
Sarah, you said you had some additional thoughts and questions.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of see how this goes and just share some of my own research, which offers an alternative, I think. And certainly I'm in agreement with the overall vibe of the project and your work and everything in this discussion. And I'm gonna double down into that prickliness of the pluralism, and recommend not only that the sort of end goal need not be friendship, but even in what you were just saying about building relationships of trust and meeting 4 times and that thing. I think that there's an alternative to that. I think as a society, we're really good when it comes to sort of self-work, when we talk about training for marathons, in spiritual contexts of all sorts, sort of upbuilding ourselves, apps that make us calm or whatever. We're pretty good at sort of recognizing, and this comes back, John, to your idea of sort of acclimating and acculturating and habituating ourselves. I think we're pretty good at the kind of need for self-work, separate from yet reaching across that aisle to meet with someone 4 times. I think we're pretty good at understanding like that we need to do more of that when it comes to lots of our goals. And I feel that we can do better, separate from even empathy and separate from common ground and relationships of trust and all of these. I think we can kind of find ways to push ourselves, not just individually, but within our own groups, within our own bubbles, to actually not reach across the aisle whatsoever until we do, or again, obviously we'll be doing it at the same time, but to find places inside of our bubbles to actually do a kind of work that I call hard hope. And it includes a variety of different, what I call uncomfortable virtues, And I won't go through all of them, but one of them, and here I'm getting inspiration from a variety of traditions. I try to be what I call post-partisan in this regard, in terms of drawing from various thinkers from different unexpected traditions to try to kind of make this clear that this isn't just a right or a left or a religious or a non-religious. I look at MLK, I look at Emmanuel Levinas. So MLK is looking at his BIPOC Christian leadership, the Jewish philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, Islamic existentialism, the queer Chicana feminism of Gloria Anzaldúa, and Marx. Those are some of my starting points for this notion of hard hope. And in a nutshell, I'll just share one piece of it. All of these thinkers, coming from very, very different perspectives, all have something in them, which is a kind of sense of odd debt, a sense that I need to feel oddly indebted to my neighbors, even if I don't like them. That is a different kind of virtue than empathy, because I might well not feel empathy, even as I am forced and must cultivate a sense of this odd debt. It certainly doesn't rely on finding common ground, because it is precisely the neighbors with whom I am least able to find common ground that I am called upon by at least these 5 very, very different traditions, I would argue, to feel a sense of odd debt. And in that regard, the idea that we might become friends is actually is entirely, civically speaking, it's not entirely personally irrelevant. I'd love to become friends with more people, but civically speaking, it can become irrelevant. And so while I appreciate, and John, you had shared that idea that working at this in political circles and in law and constitution, I think it makes sense that a lot of people speak about the time where people in Congress used to be more kind of friendly across the aisle, and I totally understand that as a model. I wonder, though, if there is something in this notion of a kind of odd sense of debt that we would be able, not magically, but with a lot of internal different work for different groups. So in other words, what a right-leaning Christian group and a right-leaning anti-religious group, or in a left-leaning Christian group and a left-leaning anti-religious group, and different religions and different non-religions, each group would kind of have to find the resources that are in its own tradition. But if you see what I mean, it's a call to foster a kind of self-discipline that really doesn't matter if we feel warm or cheerful with respect to the other, because it's a sense of responsibility that we have to take care of them anyway.
Okay, so a couple things I like about that a lot, and then maybe a slight pushback. What I like about it is an implicit, and maybe you make it explicit in your teaching, but it's a pushback against sort of a Rawlsian notion that you can somehow leave behind the greater depths of your ideological and theological resources, which is not how we are as human beings. So let's go deep to our resources and then find where there is some, maybe even just contingent common ground, and not actually ask a whole lot of what that common ground looks like. Where I would say, though, I actually think in the recognition of a mutual debt, that is finding a bit of empathy. I mean, if you actually come to the conclusion that there's a mutual debt to one another, then there's something there that is maybe at least moving toward empathy. Now, where I don't want to give up on the structural or institutional possibility of friendship is still how we engage as human beings in the ongoing project of democracy. And maybe I'm starting to wonder if perhaps where you and I are, I think, helpfully pushing back or disagreeing with each other a little bit is maybe we're envisioning 2 very different starting points for the ideal example of democracy. And so in my head right now, I'm thinking of the Supreme Court as an institution. And if you're thinking of a social movement or an activist movement, it's quite a different institutional framework and background. And maybe it's a different kind of story to tell. But to stick with my example, and this was just in the news a couple of weeks ago, Justice Sotomayor and Justice Barrett, 2 very different ideological people, right, who are often claimed in the culture wars, had a public event at Georgetown, and they said, yes, we disagree in our writing, but we are friends, and we respect each other, and we share lots of meals, and we're 9 people committed to an institution for a long time, and that matters. So you could say, well, they're being disingenuous, they don't really believe it. You could say they shouldn't believe it, they shouldn't be friends across, or you could say, no, this is actually really important to this kind of institution that plays a significant role in our democracy. And if you reach the third conclusion, which I think is where I end up, then ongoing friendship really matters, and the skills and practices of friendship matter to the getting the work done and the work of democracy. So I'm curious about, I think I would have a very different starting point if the question were, as a movement activist, how should you engage with someone in a position of power? And maybe their friendship is not the goal.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in terms of the sort of an activist group, et cetera. I guess, yes, I see exactly what you mean. And I think the examples that we're thinking of are different. But yes, in terms of the functioning of democracy by the elected officials, I see exactly what you mean. If the other example then is not necessarily some particular group, but just thinking about for the average person who picks up the book, who's not a representative in Congress, it's not even for me just the people who are in an activist modality. For me, it's like literally for everyone other than elected officials. I might put an asterisk on that and add a few others, but you know what I'm saying. I don't mean it to be like, yeah, if you're really in an activist group, then friendship shouldn't, if for that group they would say, oh, you don't need to tell us that friendship shouldn't be a goal. Don't worry about it. We're not no risk of having that be our goal. So I'm just thinking of more of the whole rest of everyone. Like, let's say 98% of American people or other people who are not in positions of power, whether it's government or other kinds of very specific civic appointed or elected or otherwise, and who are not also necessarily running the main activist group. So let's say, I don't know if I was right to guess, that's 98% of the remainder of the people, even if it's 70% of the remaining people. So does that make sense? Like, I'm talking about everyone. So that's where I'm wondering, where does friendship need to fit in with the everyone?
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. And I love this iterative. I also, by the way, that's the audience I want too, since the politicians aren't going to buy a lot of books. So that's we're in agreement there. But I do think I end the title of the chapter is "Can We Be Friends?" ? And it's important that it's a question. And I think the answer is, I don't know. I hope so sometimes. And I have examples of, here are some surprises where friendships happen. But I think it's important to name the reality that it might not happen. And I think in terms of your question here about how should you frame this for the everyday person who's trying to figure out, what should my mode of engagement look like, someone who might not even be just across the political aisle anymore, but might be in a different world from where I'm living in terms of values and priorities. And I think I think it's really just fine to have modest goals here. And if you overshoot the goals, and if you say, we're going to be friends, that's usually going to backfire. So I think I want to hold out the possibility and the surprise of friendship, and to say that in my own life it has happened in surprising ways. And also importantly to say that the habits and the practices of being a friend are important in this relationship across difference, but not necessarily to say that and the result will be friendship and we'll all be happy, because that's not what I'm suggesting.
I'd like to pick up on this a little bit. You have this great quote, John, in your last chapter, "Can We Be Friends?" And the quote is, "Real friendship depends on a blend of both shallow and deep." And I think that perhaps gets to some of what we're discussing. Perhaps what we need to disagree well is not simply discursive or intellectual virtues. Perhaps what we need are shared experiences, shared habits and rituals, shared loves and interests, and shared institutions and communities. So I was wondering if you could sort of reflect back a little bit on sort of what work you think friendship can do, but also what it takes to build the sort of resilient friendships that can sort of stand against the pressures that come with profound disagreement.
Yeah, well, and I think that question ties back to what Sarah was saying a second ago too. That, I mean, this is not a how-to book on friendship, right? This is not like, self-help and survive in the world. This is more, what are the ways in which you can best position yourself to be in these relationships across difference and to work on disagreement. And part of that does start with who you are as a person. And so to not only in the common shared activities of everyday life that you do with someone else, but also, do you have those at all in your own life, right? You want to go into some of these discussions and hard conversations with a full tank. You don't want to go in exhausted, depleted, lonely, afraid, because it's usually not going to go well. So go in with a sense of your own self, with a sense of what you believe and why, but also not being overbearing. And I think also then recognize the limitations of your own humanity and your time and your calendar and everything else. You're not going to be able to be a conversation partner for everyone you encounter who's different than you, right? I will not successfully represent all half Japanese men in America. It's just right. It's not going to happen. And people who want me to do that are placing an unrealistic or unfair pressure on me. Not that they've asked. And all of us have to limit ourselves. We don't have to get into every single issue that we might have an opinion about. That part of a functional relationship with another person is recognizing the limitations of your ability to be a friend or be a potential friend or be a dialogue partner.
And in this regard, I would say that, I would say in this regard, the good news, at least for my work, is I truly think so much of what John writes about is key without even the goal of friendship. And again, just to clarify, so I really don't think that that piece, and not only do I not think it's essential to do that work, I actually think sometimes, and John, you alluded to this before, it can actually sometimes cause more problems. Because I think that when, let's say I'm just thinking on campus, when a student group is given the impression that they are supposed to break bread with the student group who holds their opposite values, I'm not really confident. I mean, and John, you had mentioned earlier about like places where people can and should be left to their own thing, and places where, again, so I think I just worry that even in the way that activates on campuses and in the best of intentions, the idea that people should just break some more bread can actually cause problems that didn't exist. I think a lot of people have this idea that if you bring people to the table, that something good will happen, maybe, and also something bad might happen. So I just want to again share that, but I want to also just ask one other piece, whether it's empathy or, John, in your work, you lift up empathy, and that's in the subtitle of the book, and friendship is at the end. I just wanted to lift up some other words that resonated with me from the project. You speak about nuance, being able to manage ambiguity, and I want to share them per se, but also with an asterisk that none of these require sort of soft or smushy or friendly or anything. So I just want to elevate those aspects of the work, the importance of nuance, the importance of navigating between not having complete chaos and not having complete control. The importance of thinking about the difference between inquiry and activism, and maybe kind of settling into what it means to do more with inquiry, even if one is an activist. The notion of persuasion over coercion, the idea of a kind of tolerance, humility, and patience that you talk about in your Confident Pluralism book. And in this book, also a lot on the notion of aspirational language. So I just wanted to lift up, those are some of the terms that really resonate with me. Subtext, most of them don't have to do with anything warm or fuzzy, because again, I worry that while that's an amazing goal for friends, it's not an amazing goal for opponents, that were not necessary one. Could you maybe talk about any of those other ones that stand out for you, and in particular of the other ones, whichever ones you lift up? I would love to hear more about this notion of aspirational language and what role that you think that plays.
Yeah. So Let me start. I'm going to need another sentence on aspirational language to make sure I'm focusing on what you're talking about. But before that, the other, thanks for all of those words and concepts that you flagged there, because they are important. And as you were listing them, what came to my mind was, oh yeah, that reminds me that this book is also fundamentally about teaching law students how to be lawyers and how that helps everyday people in their own relationships. And so you named a bunch of lawyer skills. And you don't get this overnight. This takes a lot of practice, but it is about recognizing the complexity of arguments and the nuance of arguments. And most of the big cases that get to the Supreme Court and become the culture wars cases are hard cases for a reason. And it's seldom the case that you've got the really smart people on one side and the really stupid people on another side. It's that we've got extremely complex issues that people have argued about within different contexts and appealing to different authorities. And these are really intellectually difficult things to grasp. And the work of trying to understand both sides of the argument and understand why, in the best case, someone might reach that position, and looking for the most charitable version of that argument, those are lawyer skills. And there are lots of lawyers who don't do those things, but they're not very good lawyers. Like a good lawyer is going to so absorb and understand the other side's argument, maybe just pragmatically in order to knock it down, in order to strengthen your own side. But you've got to be able to do that work and understand, especially when you're thinking about a judge or a third-party decision maker, how am I going to persuade that person that among these two really good arguments, my argument's better, as opposed to walking into the situation and saying, I've got all the right answers and that person's an idiot, right? Which is what a lot of us do on social media. So I actually do think there's a massive corrective from the habits, practices, and examples that we have in law. And then also law, this goes back to your earlier point about the prickly pluralism. Law leaves us with a lot of unsatisfying answers. We strive for abstract notions like justice and fairness. And then we realize that in reality, those are not going to happen, even in the best of cases. We're doing proximate work. We're trying, the good faith people are trying hard, but that's still not going to give us resolution to injustice or right every wrong. And so starting with that position, I think, gives us a better sense not only of what's at stake, but why people respond in some of the ways they do. So those are my thoughts to the words and concepts you highlighted. Give me another sentence or two about the aspirational language.
Yeah, you mentioned. Oh, sorry, Matt. I can't hear. Something was wrong with the.
You're coming through like Alvin the Chipmunk there.
You do sound like Alvin and the Chipmunk. But unlike Alvin or the Chipmunks, I actually don't hear a single word. Like it's not just, it's worse than that. So I don't know what you're saying.
Sarah, why don't you go ahead and follow up on the aspirational?
Okay, yeah. So aspirational, I think you had mentioned it in the book, and maybe I think in a few places, maybe in different works, but for every time I see it, I circle it. I guess in the idea, it's connected to me to the broader question about sort of how do we habituate. You've mentioned.
Yes, got it.
How do we habituate ourselves into these kinds of dispositions, or I sometimes call them comportments, towards the other? And in that kind of context, you mentioned the importance of aspirational language. So I'd just be curious if you can share more about what you meant there.
No, yeah, thanks for flagging that. This is something that's taken me a while to work through, but I think I increasingly think that it's significant. When I first started writing about these ideas in earlier work, particularly these notions of humility, patience, and tolerance, I called them virtues in the first instance. And then what occurred to me was, no, actually, virtues take habits and practices to instantiate in human beings over time, and they require healthy institutions to embody those practices. And it wasn't clear to me then, and it's not clear to me now, where those institutions are that are shaping and habituating all of us into these virtues. So in the absence of virtues, I went with aspirations to say, surely we can at least all hope for more humility, patience, and tolerance, both on an individual level, but also on a social level. And using and deploying that language of aspirations is, I think, more descriptively accurate, because it's not saying we have those, but it is naming an imagined future that we can work toward. And if we give up on the future state, then we're kind of stuck in mediocrity. So I think that's what I mean by that particular approach.
And that's very helpful. And in that regard, I see exactly what you mean then by aspirations. I look forward to talking another time about the exact difference between habits and virtues and dispositions and aspirations, because I think about that a bunch as well. I guess one of the things, though, that strikes me is, in addition to aspirations, I think what we need are practices. And I was struck, there's some examples, and one of them that comes to mind that I'm going to say is a simple example, not to insult you, but because the opposite, like good concrete examples, like every teacher knows, have to be actually like a pretty straightforward exercise. And one example is towards the end of the book, you talk about, what if we all took a minute, and when it comes to political leaders that we don't like, and I might add neighbors that we don't like for political reasons, and that we sort of try to name some one thing that they do well. I want to amplify that. For me, that was sort of a very, very important element, because the small concrete things that we do, and someone say, okay, well, that's silly, or that's going to be, well, okay, I'll do it. Well, back to my point about training for a marathon or that kind of thing, or like using the Calm app. I mean, people really do understand the importance of a certain kind of discipline. So here I'm thinking about, like, there are actually disciplines, and they could be quite straightforward. And I really like that one as an example. So I'd just be curious if you can talk a bit more about what you think about coming up with concrete little ways, not maybe on one's own, but especially with one's in groups, that one can maybe activate certain aspirations from that concrete space.
Right. No, thanks for, I think actually the practicing concretely is a way toward cultivating these dispositions or outlooks. And there's, as we said earlier, there's no way to shortcut this. So that you actually have to sit down with other people and work on it. And sometimes it can not only feel simple, but sometimes it can feel hokey. Are we really going to run this experiment? And the answer is yes, you need to practice. So I was just with a board I was consulting on, and I distributed to the board a list of, I don't know, 8 hot button nationally divisive issues. And I gave them the national polling data that showed the country was basically split on these issues. And the homework assignment was, can you articulate the other side in a way that would not only be recognizable to them, but they would also say, yeah, like you got it. You named my position. And then I said, take this sheet of paper home and go practice it with your spouse or partner or friend. And actually the practicing of that activity, especially, you don't even have to have someone who's actually different than you, but if you can work to do that well, that is one of those little concrete things that can actually move the ball a little bit in your own life.
All right. Hopefully the technical issues are resolved. So want to bring in a few audience questions. So this question is from Sarah, and the question is, what do you think would be a good in-class activity for undergraduate students to explore the value of empathy and respect when disagreeing? It's a great question. John, any thoughts on an in-class activity that would be especially good for undergraduates?
I thought you said it was for Sarah. Oh, yeah. So yeah, I teach undergraduates as well, so we could both jump in here. But I actually think, well, this is really context dependent on the institution. But I'll share an example from a class I taught last semester to undergraduates here at Washington University. It was a political philosophy class, but toward the end of it, I had them say, come to class with 500 words on an issue that they cared deeply about, that they would be afraid to talk about publicly. And they had to talk about it in front of this seminar. It was a small class. And then I grilled them for 10 minutes on the counter arguments and made them respond to me. And so that was I think a deeply useful exercise, but it only was possible at the end of the semester, where we'd worked on trust building and a lot of common conversations. So I wouldn't recommend that on day one of a class, but I think it can happen toward the end. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, and I actually thought you said it was from Sarah. So I think, is that the case? There is another person named Sarah in
I think so, yeah.
How can that be? Okay, yeah. So I'll add. I have an exercise that I've been doing with students and actually with staff and others on campus that's called belonging and expression. And I've run sort of 90-minute versions of a workshop with our undergraduate student government. And there's also a version of it that I would just maybe want to give a quick way to do in the class for even a 15-minute exercise. I have students take out an index card and write a line down the middle of the card, and on one side write belonging, and on the other side write expression. And I tell them, take a few minutes, I give them really like 2 minutes on a timer, to jot down their thoughts as to what belonging means to them and what expression means to them. And I say, for example, belonging might mean feeling welcome, and expression might mean free speech. And then I say, you can use those examples, but take 2 minutes and come up with as many, whatever it means to you. So I give them that time. I then give them a next timed exercise, also about 1.5 or 2 minutes. And I ask them to reflect on their lists, their 2 lists, and to come up on a second index card with some thoughts about how one or more of the elements on the belonging side connect in one or more ways with something on the expression side. And I particularly, back to the tensions and the messy, I specifically sort of prompt it and say, the way the things connect might be that they're compatible. It might be that they're in tension. It might be that something on one side of the card leads you to worry about something on the other side of the card. I give them a couple of prompts to help free them up to recognize that I'm not telling them they're going to be in tension. Secretly, I do believe they're in tension, but I do give them some prompts because, again, especially as a culture, we really don't go there and we assume we want to find how it works. So I give them a few prompts on each. Reflect for 2 minutes. How do these columns align? Not the whole column, pick 1 or 2. How do they sit in tension? Come up with whatever you want. And I then open it up for little groups of 3 or 4 students talking with one another about the answers that they wrote. And that usually I give 10 minutes for a group of 3 or 4 students to talk about that, and then maybe 10 minutes for a room-wide discussion. I really cannot share with you how many unexpected, to John's point about talking about things that people feel uncomfortable about, it actually very organically, in the few times I've done it now for almost 200 people, and again, for students and staff in different contexts, it really does generate a lot of unusually resonant conversations that connect up with so much of what we've talked about without actually having to push people. People wind up pushing themselves and discussing it in those groups. So I would recommend an exercise like that.
Let's take another question from the audience. So this question is from someone who went to the University of Chicago. And this person says, I went to the University of Chicago where free expression is very important. This is true historically. Even though there are still large amounts of polarization within the student body. So a value of free expression by the institution, but still a high degree of polarization. And given this sort of tension, the fact that there's still polarization, do you think that there's going to need to be a culture shift beyond America's colleges and universities in order for us to grapple with this polarization? I'm sort of improvising a little bit off of the question that was given to me here. John, any thoughts?
A couple of things. So one, the polarization is real, but it may not be extraordinary. So, guard against presentism and look back at all of the past polarization and instability we've had as a country is the first point. Second, I do think that higher ed is going to have to be an important part of the solution to the current polarization. I mean, there are lots of challenges in higher ed right now, but these institutions are still important. And to draw on what we've been talking about for the last hour, if we can't do it here, where we have all the luxury of classrooms and time and students and these things that we get to read and talk about and write about, if we can't do it here, good luck doing it, in your busy job and workplace and life and with people you barely have time to talk to. So I think if anything, higher ed needs to model this well and train and cultivate future citizens well. And that's going to depend on some changes in higher ed. But I just want to, I think I can't underscore the importance of good leadership here.
Mhm.
That leadership that understands the purpose, mission, and values of an institution, especially an educational institution, and can keep people toward that common purpose. You can tolerate a lot of challenge and difference, and even protests and lots of other things within that framework. It's when you lose that guide and that purpose, and you throw it all up for grabs, then it becomes incoherent to the point of no longer being able to model as a training ground.
John, I'm so glad you pivoted to this point because this is something that we care about very deeply at the Campus Free Expression Project. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. What are some concrete things that faculty leaders, senior administrators can do to promote healthier disagreements, a healthier sort of discursive culture on campus? And along these lines, what should prospective students and parents be looking for in a college? With regards to free expression and civil discourse?
Yeah, I mean, the clarity about purpose and the surrounding liturgies and reminders about purpose is so important, and you can't take it for granted. And universities are these complex entities where, especially the student population is turning over every 4 years. So you're not going to have a stable group of your university community that all gets it. You're going to have to keep telling the stories and performing the liturgies and saying, here's what we believe in, here's why it matters, and also here are the rules of the game. So we don't want you. The university is actually not sort of a free speech playground, right? I don't want you coming in if you're just going to be a bomb thrower. If you're not, we have a mode of practices and a mode of discourse that the university depends upon to work on disagreement and discovery and inquiry. And if you're not interested in playing by the rules of the game, then maybe if you're at a public school campus, you have a constitutional right to be there, but you're not helping the institution in any way. And so you have these situations where sometimes the undergraduate student group will say, we need to bring in the bomb thrower to represent and it's not only ineffective, but it's not helping, it's not showing a recognition of what the purpose of the university is. And so if leaders and faculty can work with students and channel some of that passion and energy to say, yes, we want you to explore these topics and bring in these positions, and let's do it in a way where we're sharing a common purpose of the educational mission, not just trying to one up each other in a performance.
Sarah, any quick thoughts from you about possible reforms from senior university leaders that could achieve some of these goals better?
I think one of the elements that I'll add is that John mentioned social media, and I think everyone has that on their mind and their background. I think social media has done an alarmingly efficient job at making us mimetically bound to sort of follow certain threads that don't need to be followed. And so if you care about the American flag, you don't care about DEI. And if you care about DEI, you don't care about the American flag. Like, these are memes that I think we kind of need to really take a serious look at for the health of our campuses and our democracies and our own capacities to continue to live. I think one thing that campuses can try to do is to do some what might be considered controversial couplings that are not controversial. DEI and the American flag go together. And the fact that we've mimetically allowed our culture to convince us that they don't, we can't blame our students for having those sensibilities, because there's something going on in the water that's recently been designed to create these mimetic links. So what I would urge us to do is, and here I'm, moved by John, and his book talks about why he doesn't sort of go with pledges of allegiance, and why, questioning status quos, like, why are we reading mostly dead white guys in this class? We need, as a campus, to really do a better job at lifting up all of that and breaking whoever sort of happenstance or worse kinds of, in terms of creating mimetic connections between what counts as the right and what counts as the left. I think it's time for an anti-racist, interfaith affirming, anti-violent, pro-democracy spirit in higher ed. And unfortunately, I think that itself demands a great amount of creativity at this point.
That it does. And I think we're probably going to have to conclude, because unfortunately we are at the end of our time together. John and Sarah, thank you so much for such a lively conversation. I'm really grateful for both of you joining us today.
Thanks for having us. It was great to talk to you both.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so once again, John's book is called Learning to Disagree: The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. I think it's a thoughtful and thought-provoking and practical book. Each chapter has some discussion questions that can facilitate self-reflection as well as small group or classroom discussions. So it's an eminently useful book in a variety of contexts, and I hope that everyone picks up a copy when it's released on April 2nd. Before you exit the YouTube app or close this tab on your browser, I hope that all of you will subscribe to BPC's YouTube page. And I also hope that you'll go to the Campus Free Expression page at the Bipartisan Policy Center website and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. So thank you very much for your time. I hope all of you have a wonderful day.